Good morning, everyone. Welcome all attendees. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Well, good morning, everyone out there, wherever you are around the country and around the world. And welcome to today's virtual conference, which is entitled Closing the Education Opportunity Gap, Strategies and Challenges, hosted by the Program on Education Policy and Governance at the Taubman Center for State and Local Government at Harvard's Kennedy School. I'm Christopher Skowski, and I'll be today's moderator and master of ceremonies, introducing each chair, and facilitating Q&A throughout each section of the program. For those of you that are joining, today's program runs through 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time and is broken up into approximately 7 sections, including a keynote address at noon. Each of those sections includes opportunity for question and answer. And in order to engage in that, we ask that audience members and attendees use the Q&A feature on the webinar, which is at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring that Q&A section throughout the day and using those questions for each chair and panelist. It's also important to note out there that we are recording today's conference and we'll make it available for second viewing. It's an honor to be here today alongside such a distinguished group of chairs and panelists. First among them is someone who I know fairly well, our conference chairs, Professor Paul Peterson, and he's joined by CEO of EdChoice, Mr. Robert Enlow. And we're going to begin with 10 minutes of opening remarks from Professor Peterson, who is the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government in the Department of Government at Harvard University. He's also Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and Senior Editor at Education Next. But most importantly for today's conference, he's the Director of the Harvard Program on Education Policy and Governance and the chair of this conference. So Professor Peterson, good morning, and take it away. Get us started.
Well, thank you, CR. Just to let all of you out there know that Christopher Ruskowski is formerly the State Superintendent of Schools for the state of New Mexico, and we are very privileged to have him as the moderator for today's conference. You know, this is actually the 25th anniversary of the program on education policy and governance. And even though we can't gather together and have toast, I do want to remember that moment way in the past. I pulled up a letter from the dean of the Kennedy School at the time, Joseph Nye, who, and I'm quoting, "I am delighted at the prospect of having the program of education policy and governance in our midst, and I'm eager to provide all feasible support," right? All feasible support in enabling you to make it the premier initiative of its type in the nation. In thinking about what specific commitments the school, including the Taubman Center, can make, I have sought to balance these considerations. 1, the high priority that I attach to PEPG. 2, the high potential for a dean's actions to be read as precedents by other potential beneficiaries. And I don't know quite what that means, but you can probably gather the basic point there. And 3, the school's overall budgetary situation. So given that in mind, I will join you and the Taubman Center in seeking current use gifts for support of PEPG's work in the amount of $200,000 or more. And in the coming year, you will have $20,000 for your conference on educational choice. Even back then, that was what we were supposed to focus on. And I'll allocate $20,000 in each of the next 3 fiscal years for PEPG activities. Well, that was a beginning. And from that beginning, we've come a long ways. We've got a fairly sizable program marked by a lot of students in our fellowship program, a lot of research activities out there, and of course, we have our journal, Education Next. And I'm wondering, is Marty West with us yet? If not, I'll introduce him later on in the conference when he joins us. He's the editor-in-chief of Education Next, and that's one of our highest, most important activities. In addition, of course, to today's conference and the many other conferences that we have held over the 25 years. Well, none of this would be possible were it not for Antonio Wentland, our Associate Director. So Antonio, could you say a word? We depend so heavily for your support, both today and in the past. So just can you say a word to the group?
Sure. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for giving us part of your day, perhaps a good chunk of your day. It's been a pleasure to be here with the program for now 20 years and watch this program under the stewardship of Professor Peterson grow, watch someone like Marty come in as a PhD student, leave, get an assistant professorship, come back, receive tenure, be handed the baton for the journal as the editor-in-chief, watch our fellowship programs go from when we had money to sponsor one student a year to a vigorous program where we have numerous postdocs and pre-docs. And the research that we do here is just so timely. It's been a pleasure to be part of this group.
Well, thank you, Antonio. The other group that I really do need to thank is our advisory committee, which has provided so much support over the years and has allowed us to expand our operations in the way that we have, and has made the case to the foundations around the country who have provided so much support for our activities over these many years. So we are grateful to all those donors and all those foundations who have been committed to our goal of providing objective research on the most pressing issues in US education. And none is more important than closing the education opportunity gap. So we thought on the 25th anniversary of the program on education policy and governance that we should highlight this continuing passionate commitment that we have to address the inequalities within our society, inequalities that we do not believe can be eliminated without closing the education opportunity gap. So with that, I'm going to turn the opening remarks section of this conference to Robert Enlow, who has partnered with us on many occasions. Robert is the chair of EdChoice, the CEO of EdChoice. Under his leadership, EdChoice has become one of the nation's most respected advocates for educational choice, working in dozens of states to advance parental freedom and education by disseminating research, undertaking training, sponsoring seminars, and doing much more. So, Robert, it's just a joy to have another opportunity to work with you. Thank you for helping us launch this particular conference.
Professor Peterson, thank you so much for having me and for those comments. And in fact, as you were talking, I was reminded that EdChoice, formerly the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice, is now going into its 25th anniversary. And our first support as an organization that we made, among our first support was to the PEP-G program and you for research, because we believed and understood how important your work was to ensuring that education reform received the fairest possible shake in the academic world. And so I want to thank you, Paul, for having us, for allowing us to sponsor this symposium, and thank the Harvard Kennedy School and the Program on Education Policy and Governments. So briefly, those of you who know me have known that I've said this 1,000 times, because the guy over my shoulder said it. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around at the time. That, I believe, is our basic function, Milton Friedman said, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. We've been in an educational crisis discussion since the 80s, and it has been this group of people and these panelists in Harvard that has brought all of these ideas to keeping them alive and taking them to the next step. That's why I think today is so important and why EdChoice is so happy to sponsor it as an organization, because this group of people and these discussants and these panelists and these attendees are the ones keeping the ideas alive so that they can become politically inevitable. Thank you again, Paul, for letting me sponsor, and I'm looking forward to the day.
Thank you, Rob. I noticed that the clock says we're 3 minutes ahead of schedule, and that's where we hope to be throughout the conference. So why don't we begin? CR, take it over.
Thank you, Professor Peterson. And again, good morning to all of you that are joining us. I see a few more attendees have joined. We're going to move right into part one of today's conference, which focuses on the opportunity gap. And we'll begin with the presentation of 2 research papers that bring together the latest findings with respect to socioeconomic status and sector gaps and opportunities in American K-12 conversation. This is a 1-hour block. As Paul noted, we're a couple minutes ahead of schedule, so it's a 1 hour and 2 minute block, or 1 hour and 1 minute block, running from 9:45 to 10:45 this morning. We hope to reserve about 10 minutes at the end of the presentations and a discussion for audience Q&A. So if you're out there as an attendee in the audience around the country and around the world, please do type your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the webinar, which I'll be monitoring throughout this session. I plan to pose a few of your questions to the chair and to the panelists and the presenters at the end of the hour block. And as a reminder for those of you that just joined us, we are recording today's event. So kicking us off here as the chair of our first block for today, as part one of the chair, is Dr. Ludger Woseman. He'll be chairing this morning's presentations. He's the professor of economics at the University of Munich and the director of the IFO Center for the Economics of Education and at the IFO Institute. He is also a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Professor, I will hand you the virtual microphone to kick off part one, the opportunity gap.
Well, thanks so much. It's a great honor for me to be here. Happy birthday to PAPG. I had the pleasure to interact with many of you over many years. So we have a couple of papers here to be presented. As Paul has already noted, time is short, so I really want to jump in it right away. The first paper is going to be presented by Eric Henushik. Rick is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he's been, well, a leader of the development of the field of economics of education in general. He's done work in all areas of the economic analysis of educational issues, and he's been doing it all the time. Just last night, he presented a new report to the OECD on how the COVID-19 crisis will affect and the school closures will affect future productivity of those affected and of nations. So you can see all this is on all the economic aspects that he's been doing. He's going to present a paper today that's really terrific, and I'm not saying this because of the fact that I'm a co-author of this. Of course, it's just a terrific paper. Rick, the floor is yours. You've got 14 minutes to present.
Thanks very much, Ludger. Out here, the sun will come up soon in California, but before the sun comes up, let's talk about achievement gaps. I'm going to try to share my screen and see if we can get this presentation going. There we are. There is, as Ludger noted, a list of authors that includes Paul Peterson, the Harvard professor who is chairing this whole session, and Jacob Light, Laura Talpe, and Ludger Wussman. This paper has had a long history. There's a version of it that's available from the National Bureau of Economic Research. But let me start quickly with the background. We know from a variety of other works that cognitive skills are really important for economic outcomes. They affect economic growth. They're probably the most important determinant of economic growth rates of countries around the world. And it has cognitive skills have a very strong influence on individual skills. With the importance of cognitive skills has come the interest in ensuring equity and that there is intergenerational mobility. We don't have a permanent poor class, or we hope we don't. And so we want to use education to try to improve the situation of disadvantaged students. And that's the question we're asking. Now, the overview of the PEPG program is 25 years old. The War on Poverty is 55 years old. This started with Lyndon Johnson. And one of the important things in 1965 was the emphasis on human capital. The idea was very simple. Achievement and skills was a combination of families and schools. And if we were going to make up for deficits of kids born in families that were not as supportive as others, the schools had to come in and play a role. And they were responsible for trying to close gaps between students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So what did we do? We started with significant government programs. Title I, which is a compensatory education program, Head Start, which is early childhood, and IDEA, which is the programs for special education. We had a variety of state school finance policies and court cases related to equity and improving the schools, particularly for the poor. We had desegregation policies actually beginning before the War on Poverty. And our simple question here is, has it worked? Well, let me give you the findings since we have a very short time period here. The findings are, if we look at SES gaps, which I'll define in a minute, but we're going to look at students that are in the top 25th percentile of the SES distribution. That's the 75th part of this, compared to those in the bottom quarter of the distribution, 25. That's the 75-25 gap. Or if we look at just how the top quarter does to the bottom half of the distribution, or how the top half of the distribution does to the bottom quarter, the 50-25 gap, what we find is that it's been flat for half a century. There's no evidence of rising gaps, but likewise, there's no evidence of narrowing gaps. Secondly, all boats haven't risen. The gaps could remain the same if everybody was getting systematically better, but that doesn't appear to be the case. It's a little bit hard to work it out, but it's hard to attribute programmatic failure to worsening of families. There are some aspects that have gotten worse, some that have gotten better. The bottom line here, which we're not going to answer, is that we think that there needs to be a rethinking of programs and policies because our 55 years of programs haven't done what we want the programs to do. So what was done in this study? What we did was compile longitudinal data on student performance. We used US Department of Education data and international data. There are 4 major surveys that we used. We used the long-term National Assessment of Educational Progress, the main National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the primary US source of information on student achievement across the nation, across states. We used the international TIMSS data, Trends in International Math and Science Study data, and we used the PISA data, the Program for International Student Assessment. These, just an overview of the description of the data. If we start here, the long-term NAEP, which follows students at age 13, and it's been looking at cohorts since 1958 through 1999. If you look on the right-hand side, it has 12 assessments of math scores and 12 assessment of reading scores for these 13-year-olds, giving us 24 observations of performance according to the NAEP. That combines over the years of this program, 215,000 observations. We added to that, long-term NAEP has a 17-year-old component, which started with an earlier cohort and adds another 24 observations. The main NAEP has assessments at grade 8 and started in 1990, or for the cohort, birth cohort, starting in 1976 up to 2001. That gives another 21 observations for 2 million more student data points on math and science, math and reading scores. The TIMSS data has been done internationally for a long period of time, but what we use is the data for the 1981 to 2001 cohorts, because those data achievement scores are longitudinally linked so that we can follow students. That's another 12 observations on math and science. And finally, PISA, which started in 2000, the birth year of 1985 for age 15-year-old students, gives us 17 observations. Now, the important part of all of these tests is that within each test, there is psychometric linking of achievement scores, so that if you see scores in one year, you can compare them to scores in another year and know that you're comparing the same kind of performance over the same measures. Now, what we did was combine that with measures of the socioeconomic status of students, or the SES distribution. And we get this from the survey questions that each survey has going along with the testing program. What we do is combine measures of parental education with items in the home. So each year they ask a variety of questions, like how many books are there in your home? Do you have washing machines, televisions, cars, computers, etc.? And we combine all of those with a principal component analysis in each year and each assessment. So we know the distribution of students according to their background data, and we link that to the performance of students at different points in the achievement distribution. That allows us to combine the data over time and to develop trends for different for performance of people at different points in the distribution. So what we do is we have a total of 96 possible observations, but unfortunately we can't use them all, because when you start looking at the distribution, you don't get good information on students at the very tails of the distribution. It's popular today to do things like compare the 90th percentile to the 10th percentile. But when you look at the achievement data and you look at the information you have on the socioeconomic status of students, you find that you don't actually observe people at the 90th and the 10th percentile or above those, that it's ambiguous because you have open-ended questions. And so of the 96 possible, we have to, we drop back and not look at the 90-10 gap, but the 75th to 25th, 75-25 gap. That's those in the top quarter of the distribution versus those in the bottom quarter of the distribution. When we do that, we can use 81 of our observations of different birth cohorts from those 4 surveys, testing regimes that I described before. If we actually go to a slightly larger tail of the distribution, the 70-30 gaps, we can add some more observations. We can get up to 89 observations where we observe people within the top 30th percentile and people below the bottom, in the bottom 30th percentile. It turns out that it doesn't make much difference to look at the 75-25 versus the 70-30. If we wanted to actually look at the 90-10 gap and restrict it to places where we actually observe people in those ranges of the distribution, we would actually lose half of our observations. We'd be down to 51 observations at the 90-10. So we really don't spend time with the 90-10 because we lose too much information. Now what we do is estimate a trend. And this fancy equation basically says we look at, on the left-hand side, the delta in achievement, or the difference between those in the top 25% versus those in the bottom 25%. And what we do is estimate a quadratic trend. We allow it to change over time. That's the beta terms of this. And T is the birth cohort that people are from, and T squared is the square of that birth cohort. And then we add dummy variables, fixed effects for which test it is, what subject we're looking at, whether it's math, reading, or science, and what age group we're looking at, since we look at some 13-year-olds, some 17-year-olds, and so forth. And all we're doing is saying, what's that trend look like when we eliminate any difference of just the testing between TIMSS and NAEP or science and math? Here is not the gaps by SES, but the absolute performance. And what we see is that there's been a slight decline in the performance, in the variance of performance over time, according to all of our tests. So the 90-10 gap.
I have to ask you to finish within a minute.
Okay, here's the gap for the 75-25, perfectly flat. Here's the gap for the 75-25 and the 70-30, again, perfectly flat. They're insignificantly different from a linear trend. Reading and math are the same. 50, top 50 versus bottom 50. What you see is everything's the same except for the black-white gap. And that closed 25 years ago, I think largely due to desegregation policies, but free and reduced price lunch and black-white gap doesn't. So I'm going to skip ahead here and say, what's changed? Well, we've had some things that you would expect to expand the gap: widening income distribution, mother's age at birth, expanding single-parent families. But that's been offset by improved parental education, smaller families, and the overall improvements in IQs, the Flynn effect. We've had all these policies. They don't seem to have done anything. They haven't hit this gap. So findings are flat gaps over half a century, no evidence of rising gaps. All boats haven't risen. I slipped over that. And it's hard to attribute the failure to worsening families. It's time to rethink our programs and policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. Very good. We are gonna have a discussion first. At the end of the session, we have the Q&A section where everybody can pose the questions. The discussant will be Matthew Chingos. Matt is the director of the Urban Institute's Education Policy Program. He's been working on all sorts of issues from pre-K through post-secondary education. He has a couple of books on student debt and on college completion. Matt, over to you for your discussion.
Great. Well, great to be part of this. Happy birthday to PEPG, and especially congratulations to Paul. I've been part of PEPG for a long time, starting more than 10 years ago. It doesn't feel that long. So let me share my slides. So I really enjoyed having a chance to dig into this great paper by Rick and Paul and Ludger and their co-authors. So we just heard it. So the quick recap is that this stylized fact that's been out there for a while that achievement gaps by SES are getting bigger turns out not to be true. They haven't widened. So they have stayed the same or maybe narrowed a little bit in some cases. Worth emphasizing, the data in this paper are mostly on middle school age students, students aged 13 to 15, depending on the different tests. Also have 17-year-olds in one of the data sets. Worth pointing that out because we've seen different kinds of trends at sort of elementary grades, middle grades, and high school grades overall. So really what we're seeing here is mostly for middle school students. And as Rick told us, SES is construed here as an index based on parent education and home resource variables. So kind of a couple comments / suggestions from me. One is to kind of show us the data whenever you can. I think this first figure you did is great. We can kind of see what the data look like over time, and then you can kind of squint and decide what kind of line you want to draw. The preferred approach in the paper is to do a quadratic equation, but I push the authors to think a bit about, at least be more transparent about how much that matters and in what cases. So I picked one example where it does matter. I'm sure it doesn't matter as much in others, but this is the long-term trend reading for 13-year-olds. These are the points, just a picture I made from the data in the paper's appendix. And when you look at these points, what kind of line do you want to draw through them? You draw a linear line, it looks like that. It looks like it's going up. If you draw a quadratic line, it's gone up, but only kind of a tiny bit. If you draw a cubic function, there's been some jokes about the cubic model this year, it looks like a huge increase. So this is just I don't think the results in general are that sensitive to this decision, but I think when you kind of break things out, I always like being able to see those data points. So the kind of reader can judge, do they like the function you chose, or would they pick something different? Second thing I push you to think a bit more about is the issue of measurement error. So this is addressed in the paper. This is a great figure, by the way, from the paper. And the authors use it to highlight a data point that they actually throw out. They don't include it because so many kids are in this top category, as Rick mentioned, in the NAEP 1990 data. But I push the authors to think a bit about measurement error beyond that issue. So let's say it only been 23% in that top category. They would have included the data point, but you can see it's a lot coarser of a measure in the 1990 data than the 2015 data. So what I want to push the authors to think about is it possible that measurement error has fallen over time as the survey questions have gotten richer and better? And if that's the case, that would mean that it would look like the gaps are getting bigger than they really are. So it could be the case that the gaps are actually falling, and if there's increasing measurement over time, the truth could be that the gaps are actually shrinking rather than staying the same as the results show here. Something I'd be interested to hear a little more about in the paper. Another issue is SES versus income. So if you sort of did a quick look at, well, the original Reardon paper from 2011 showed widening gaps by income, you might come to this paper and say, well, the gaps just now are not widening by SES because SES is, as measured here, is just different than income. So there's a really interesting paper from Tom Kane and some of his colleagues at the Harvard Ed School showing that that's not the case, that actually pretty consistent results, and if anything, they find more evidence of shrinking gaps than Rick and Paul and Ludger and their co-authors do. So another interesting paper I had a chance to dig into this week that I think is really complementary. It takes a pretty different approach, but also finds that there's really no evidence that these achievement gaps by socioeconomic status have widened over the last couple of decades. And the last thing I'd love to hear about maybe in the discussion today is kind of the so what here. Obviously, it's an important and useful finding that this conventional wisdom about widening achievement gaps by SES is wrong. But I'd love to hear more about what the authors think, what this tells us about the role schools play in narrowing achievement gaps by SES. So would their conclusions in the paper, for example, be different if gaps had widened versus stayed the same, or maybe if they've even gotten smaller, as the other paper I mentioned shows? Now, I think we assume correctly that the existence of universal free public schooling narrows achievement gaps relative to a world in which there were no free public schools and everyone had to pay their own way. I think the question we're interested in is whether schools are doing a better or worse job than they did in the past at narrowing achievement gaps. And I don't think that's fundamentally a question with a super knowable answer, but I'd be curious to kind of hear the author's views on what kinds of evidence, including the evidence they presented, what other kinds of evidence would help us really get at that question, not just of what's happening in the world, this kind of big descriptive picture, but really what's the role that schools play. So thank you again for the opportunity to read this paper, and great work.
Great, Matt. That gives a good perspective on the paper for everybody who's in the room. Rick, do you want to have a minute or two to respond, or do we want to go on and have general discussion?
Let me give a couple quick responses. I want everybody to know that Matt was not a plant in the audience. What he pointed out is looking at alternative SES measures and measurement errors is exactly what we've been doing over the last couple months. And it turns out to be, if you look at the different surveys independently, drop one of the surveys out of the 4, et cetera, it actually doesn't change the picture very much. And we try to hold constant the SES measures for the questions over time to make sure it's not just something over time. That doesn't seem to make much difference. But we're in the process of producing the next version of this paper, which has been a long struggle because of this problem of measuring SES. I personally don't see the big distinction between SES and income. I think that it's not that parents have more income to spend and they spend it on things that buy education, or that having a washing machine allows the mother to do more education. What I really think is going on is that we know that parenting skills and parenting behavior is systematically correlated with income, SES, wealth, and that what we're doing is looking at a proxy for the role of parents. And the so what, I think, is the answer that we keep fighting to put more money into Title I and fighting to put more money into Head Start and these other programs. And we don't look at the evaluations of whether they're doing what we hope they do. Now, they might be providing some offset to worsening families, but they're certainly not leading to the results that we want, which is a narrowing of these achievement gaps. And to me, it points to simply, let's look more deeply at how we can organize programs that accomplish the purpose that we have. Thank you.
Thanks. And thanks both of you for being so good of staying in time, which really allows us to have a nice Q&A section at the end of this session. But before that, actually, let's first look at the second paper and listen to that, and then have a combined Q&A session. So the second paper is a paper by Danny Shakil and Paul Peterson. Well, Paul has already been introduced by CR, and we all know him anyway, so that's said and done. Danny is a postdoctoral research fellow also at PEPG, so the Program on Education Policy and Government at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's interested in all sorts of questions in the politics of education, has worked quite a lot on different issues of school choice, and I think he's going to present the paper to us today. Danny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ludger. Paul was supposed to present the first few slides. Is Paul here?
Yes. Thank you, Danny. I'll just set up the study, and Danny will report the results. Can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you. Just go ahead.
Okay, good. So we're working with data very similar to the information that was just supplied. So Danny, let's move on. We're working with the NAEP data, the main NAEP data, and we're using this data to look at whether or not charter schools have improved more over time than district schools. Which sector has improved the most over the period between 2005 and 2017? And that's a period when the charter sector is growing quite rapidly, from 2% of all public school enrollments in 2005 to 6% in 2017. The rate of growth has slowed, and that sort of suggested the question to us, have charters proven not to be so effective? And is that the reason for the slowdown? And specifically, what's the effect on ethnic minorities and low SES students? So our basic findings are that indeed the charter sector is making greater gains over this period that amount to an additional 3 months worth of learning. That's a third of a year. And that the gains are especially large for African Americans, especially in math at 8th grade, but in general, especially large for African Americans, and also for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. That's our main findings. Now that's different from what you generally read about the charter sector, which most of the literature says that there's really not much difference in the performance of students, although there are some exceptions for some schools that are particularly well designed and probably follow the no excuses model. But on the whole, most of the reviews of the literature summarize that literature as showing very little difference between the two sectors. So this is also true of the Credo research, which is the most large-scale research. They find very little difference between the two sectors, but they do find some improvement over time. And then there's a study in Texas that Rick Aniszek's been part of, which shows some improvement. But these are for short periods of time. In the case of the Credo study, 4 years, and in the case of the Texas study, a longer period of time, but it's only for one state. So this is the first time we have a way of talking about the trends nationwide. So I think I have just said that. We're taking the data from the main NAEP, 4th and 8th grade math and reading, 4 million tests, 140,000 observations for charter students. These tests are nationally representative, and they're representative for each state. And this is basically the standard equation that was just presented to you by Rick, so I'll pass over this. And the background characteristics that we're able to control for in this analysis are at the 4th grade level for ethnicity, gender, and free and reduced price lunch status. And at the 8th grade level, we're able to also control for parental education, computer availability in the home, number of books in the home, because for those students, NAEP asked students to report on these things. They didn't do so for the 4th graders. We don't control for special ed and English language learner status because the way those programs get implemented differ by sector. But if we did do a robustness check to see if that would have changed the picture, and it doesn't. It just doesn't make any difference whatsoever. We could have just well controlled for them. So just to emphasize how big is a standard deviation between 4th and 8th grade, on average in 2005 and 2017, the difference is 1.23 standard deviations over that 4 years. They're on, because you can actually compare the 4th and 8th grade performances because the two tests overlap a bit. And so NAEP allows for these kinds of comparisons. So that implies that about 0.3 standard deviations is 1 year or 9 months worth of learning. Danny, let's just pass on. And you can report the results.
Thank you, Paul, for the previous slides. I'll report the results. So this first slide reports the difference in gains between charter schools and district schools, and these are gains for cohorts. We don't have students tracked over time, so these are cohort gains. On the y-axis, we have the standard deviations. On the x-axis, we have subjects, math and reading. And for each grade, we report trends without adjustment and with adjustment for the student background characteristics. If you look at 8th grade mathematics, the unadjusted gains are a quarter standard deviation, which amounts to almost 6 months of additional learning at charter schools over this 12-year time period in comparison to district schools. The gains are smaller at 4th grade in comparison to 8th grade. For 8th grade reading, the gains are smaller than 8th grade math. They are about 0.11 standard deviation without adjustment, which amounts to a third of a year of extra learning at charters. If we account for student background characteristics, they shrink to half and amount to 0.06 standard deviation. So what do these gains mean overall? At 8th grade math, they mean that charter schools produce 6 months of additional learning over this time period. For 8th grade reading, it's 2 months of additional learning. And at 4th grade, both in math and reading, it is 2 months of additional learning at charters. If we break our sample by ethnicity, we have 4 categories here: African American, White American, Hispanic, and Asian American. We find particularly for the African Americans, the difference in gains between the two sectors are substantially larger. They amount to 0.19 standard deviation without adjustment. With adjustment, they shrink slightly. For white Americans, we have smaller gains than their black counterparts. They amount to 0.12 standard deviation, which is almost a third year of an additional learning. If we control for background characteristics, half of them can be explained and the gains shrink by half to 0.06 standard deviation, which means that the background characteristics can only explain half and the other half cannot be explained. It is interesting to note that the Hispanic Americans and the Asian Americans do equally well in both sectors. So there is no difference at all. So these results mean that the African Americans are particularly registering extra gains in maths at charter schools. For 8th grade, the difference amounts to additional year in math. It amounts to 3 more months of additional learning in reading. If we look at 4th grade for African Americans, it amounts to 3 more months of additional learning in math as well as in reading. Here we break our sample for 8th grade by socioeconomic status, and we look at the top quartile and the bottom quartile of the socioeconomic status distribution. This is only for 8th grade because questions for SES are not asked at 4th grade. So we see in the lowest SES quartile, the gains are substantially large. They are 0.17 standard deviation without adjustment. And if we make adjustment for student background, they are similar. In the highest SES quartile, they are 0.19 standard deviation, but after adjustment, they shrink to 0.13 standard deviation. If we break our sample by region, and this region is in alignment with the US Census, Northeast, Midwest, South, and West, the gains are particularly large in the Northeast. So charters on average register gains of 0.24 standard deviation in comparison to the gains in district schools over time. And this is the results after making adjustment. Once we go from Northeast to Midwest, the adjusted gains are 0.11 standard deviation. In South, they are smaller, 0.07 standard deviation. In the West part of the country, And the Western states, there's no difference in gains between charter schools and district schools. They are doing equally well. If we divide the sample by locale, and I'm only showing you city and suburb, for cities, and if you see the first red dotted square, we see that the average gains for charter schools in comparison to district, the gains in district schools are 0.15 standard deviation. But if we make adjustment for student background, they shrink to 0.076 standard deviation. So there is some effect of charters in the cities. But if we go to suburbs, we find that without adjustment, the difference in gains between two sectors is 0.08 standard deviation. But once we account for the student background characteristics, there is no difference. It becomes 0. So the conclusion from our study is first that the gains by the cohorts of charter students are approximately twice as large as the gains that are registered by the cohorts in the district sector. We find larger gains and the greatest for African Americans among all ethnic groups. The gains are also higher for students from the lowest socioeconomic status quartile in comparison to those from the highest socioeconomic status quartile. The gains are also largest among the northeast part of the country in comparison to the other census regions. There has been a recent opposition to the charter growth politically, and we do not find that it could be because of the decline in their productivity. Thank you.
Great. Thanks to both of you for a very nice presentation. The paper will be discussed by Guido Schwert. Guido is the professor of public economics at the University of Constance in Germany. And just like Danny now, Guido at some point in time was also a postdoc research fellow at PEPG. He's also a former colleague of mine here in Munich. It's great to see you again, Guido. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Ludger. Thanks for this kind introduction. Happy birthday. Congratulations to Paul. Happy birthday to PEPG. As Ludger said, a couple of years back, I spent a great year at PEPG as a postdoctoral research fellow. I really enjoyed it, and I personally benefited a lot from this year. And it is a great pleasure for me now to discuss Danny's and your paper here now. Let me just share my screen with you. So yeah, in general, I think it's a very important paper. The big contribution of the paper is that it's basically the first paper to study the aggregate trends in performances across cohorts in the charter sector relative to the districts sector. I think that's having this aggregate trends as evidence on the table is very important for educational governments in this area. Let me just briefly recap the main findings of the paper as I see them. So the paper finds, and that's good news, I guess, that there are positive trends in both sectors, and apparently the upward trends are much steeper in the charter sector. The paper attributes roughly 1/3 of this gain to changes in observed characteristics of students going to the charter sector, and consistent with some other evidence that's out there, differentials seem to be a bit larger for African American students, lower SES students, and students in the Northeast. I have a couple of more general thoughts on the paper that I want to share with you, and then I have also 2 or 3 specific comments. So I think the big elephant in the room is the question, is it all selection, or is it at least partly due to actual increases in school quality in the charter sector? The paper suggests that only about 1/3 of the difference can be explained by changes in observed characteristics of students. Of course, it's limited to the observed characteristics that are available in the data. And then there's always the question, what about unobserved characteristics? So I want to push the authors a little bit to think about ways to present the reader a bit with an idea of how large the selection would have to be based on unobserved student characteristics to explain away the entire effect. So I'm thinking about versions of the techniques that are out there, pioneered by in a paper by Altonji, Elder, and Tabor a couple of years ago. Then the paper presents at some point a very intriguing argument saying, look, this is whether it's selection or not, or actual genuine quality increases, it's good news no matter what, because selectivity and quality go hand in hand. You know, you argue that selectivity and quality are likely to reinforce each other. And at first glance, I think this is a very convincing argument, and probably also at second glance. But if you want to be the devil's advocate here and think a little bit further about that, you can probably come up with some not too unplausible stories where that might not be the case. So you can imagine that at first a very homogeneous group of students enters charter sector from very low backgrounds. Over time, the student body in charter schools, they get more heterogeneous, and that may create some additional problems, making teaching a bit more difficult, which might have an impact on value-added scores, which may have an impact on school quality. So I'm not saying that this is probably the most plausible scenario, but at least such a scenario could exist, and that could be the case that there are even sort of negative developments with respect to teaching quality that are, however, completely concealed by this positive selection effects. And I think the paper could do a bit more there. And basically, I think what it boils down to is the paper should present a bit more what sort of or not really a model, but you could say a little bit more about what kind of model you have in mind that governs school choice, or the sector choice here, and what does it depend on, right? I think that would be terrific here at this point. A couple of specific comments. I think a very important question, I don't really feel fit to answer that because I don't know the data too well, is the question whether the sample of charter students in the NAEP is actually nationally representative. All I can say here that I think the paper does a really good job in discussing this issue, but maybe that's an important question for the discussion also at the end. I was thinking that the paper could also be extended a little bit in the sense that it could look at other outcomes across the distribution of test scores. It focuses heavily on mean differences, but you could also look at share of proficient students or share of students above other meaningful thresholds. I think that also would add nice pieces of evidence to the literature. Yeah, another specific comment. So when you look at the models, model 1 and 2, it's sometimes not so easy to see how standard errors are calculated that are presented in the paper. I would probably like to see is a very simple extension of models 1 and 2 that interacts or that adds interactions for the linear and the quadratic term there, and then pools the data for district and public schools, and then you can right away from the t-statistics on the interaction terms get a sense on how different these trends at least are. And so finally, or the last comment actually is I was thinking a little bit on how to extend this model. Obviously, that's a little bit, the flexibility here is limited because of the data. You have a couple of very important background characteristics. Apparently, you don't have much more. But I think what you could also do is play around a little bit with respect to the parameters. I mean, it's not only that the axis may have changed over time, but maybe also the impact of the axis may have changed on trends. So you could, for example, extend the basic version of the model that you have with some time varying beta case, maybe sort of in 5-year periods, and see what happens to your main estimates. So that's basically what I had to say about the paper. Again, I enjoyed reading it. It's a great paper. So thanks.
Thank you, Guido, for a very lucid discussion and for staying in time. Danny and Paul, you want to have a minute or two to respond quickly?
Yes, I think Danny might have a comment too. I just mainly want to thank Guido for those very useful suggestions as to what the next steps are. We've just begun this paper, unlike the previous paper, which has gone through various stages. This one, we've just managed to get to this point. And so these are really helpful suggestions for moving forward. I do think that one of the reasons we wanted to show the trends for the district sector and the charter sector separately, which we didn't really focus on in this presentation, because we wanted to say, okay, is the district sector improving at all? And we do see an improvement in the district sector over this 12-year period as measured by the main NAEP. It's not as if there's been no improvement at all in the performance of cohorts of students as they're going through the district schools. They are progressing, but it's not very impressive. It's a very meager pace. And the pace at the charter school sector is twice the pace at that sector. And so that was one of the reasons we wanted to do this. Now, I think we actually, Danny might have a comment on pooling the data because I know he's been working on that.
Yes, thank you, Paul, for the comment. So one reason we could not do the value-added adjustment is because we don't have the prior test score of the students, and we don't track them over time. So that's why we have to model them this particular way. We might definitely consider estimating the amount of bias in data. Thank you for those two papers. We did address the national representativeness of the data by comparing the NAEP data to the NCES data in one of the tables in the paper. And that's the best we can do with the two data sets, NAEP and NCES surveys. The charter sector seems to be representative quite well. And we also use weights provided by NAEP for further representativeness. Apart from that, for the standard errors, we do discuss in the paper that if they're larger than the joint standard errors of the district and charter models, we consider them to be significant. This is again a paper that is not, I apologize, somebody's on my door. I don't
All right,
thanks.
Thanks for the comments. I think we should open the floor to the audience now for the general discussion. Don't know, Chris, are you gonna pick the Q&As, or should I read? I've already seen there's quite a number of very interesting questions, so we're gonna have lots of things to discuss for the final.
Yeah, yes, Luger, and I've been looking at them as well, and I've been sorting through them. And Matt Chingos and I see Rick Hanishek are gonna rejoin us on the virtual stage. So Matt, if you'll rejoin us. But I think the first couple of questions, there were a couple of themes here, Ludger, around, particularly for the charter school presentation, around these differences in the Northeast charter schools compared to other regions. So Paul and company, were there meaningful differences in policies for authorizers in Northeast states that might have led to different results? Basically, why is there a difference between the Northeast and elsewhere?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we can't really speculate on that, but it is the case that the authorizers in the Northeast are often complimented for the care with which they decide whether or not somebody should be allowed to set up a charter school. And that's true in Massachusetts and in New Jersey. We have Chris Cerf here, who played a major role in New Jersey and Washington, D.C. and New York. So there's a lot of places in the Northeast where you see reasons to think that the authorizers did a particularly good job. And in the West, it's a little bit more like the Wild West. And so that's sort of an informal comment. I don't know that we have the evidence to really do that, but it might be worth our digging into the data more deeply to see if we can find some support for that proposition.
Paul, there's also a question about whether or not the charter schools that were included in this research, were they primarily large-scale charter management organizations? Were they small single sites? Were they Montessori, language immersion? What sort of realm of charters were included in this study?
I don't think we're able. Danny, do you want to comment on that? Are we able to do anything on that front?
So we have that in mind, but for subsequent work, as of now, we have not tracked the type of authorizers, etc. But we can do that in future.
And along that same lines, I know, Guido, if you're still on, if you'll rejoin us on stage, there was a question about asking you to expand upon this point of selectivity of students in charter schools. What are the implications for charter schools that have selective enrollment policies that may be leaving some of the poorest, most struggling students in the traditional public schools?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So what I meant to say here with this elephant in the room is obviously the question is there some sort of negative development in terms of educational quality that is hidden, that is completely sort of dominated by a positive selection into the charter schools? And that's not really clear from the data, right? It could be to some extent. The paper suggesting to some extent that's the case, but you know, why would we worry if generally there is some improvement there? And I think as long, and I agree with Paul, it was very important also to show that there are positive trends also in the district sector. So there is no sign of sort of negative effects of creaming students. I don't even know to what extent this is the case, but at least I think all the evidence, at least from this paper, is not pointing towards any really big problem here based on this evidence. But the question is really, how large is this improvement and how much is it really reflecting improvements in educational quality? And then the big question is, as Paul also said it in the very beginning, why then, if this is so successful, are we not seeing more and more demand in the charter sector?
So what you need to do here is to show that the selection effect is occurring within ethnic groups, within SES groups. Because once you've controlled for these observables, you're controlling for a lot of the potential selection that might have occurred. So for example, if charter schools are now shifting their locations so that they're getting more and more white students instead of so many minority students, well, that could be, you know, we're able to observe that. So the selection that, if it is taking place, it's got to be selection that's taking place within these demographic categories. That somehow the schools serving the Black community are being more and more selective over time, chasing away all the poor, unprepared students away. So, you know, we don't, you know, there's no stories out there, there's no anecdotes out there that suggest that. I do think it's useful to explore, as Guido, you've suggested, that we could see to what extent that could possibly explain this. But I think that to say that this is all selection, it would be, that's a very one-sided interpretation of the trends. But it's worth exploring to see how much we can narrow that down.
I agree that it would be worth actually exploring it further. I mean, we know that, I mean, you can put in some of these observable SES background factors, but then if you've got another data set which is richer in background factors, like, I mean, I've often seen that in TIMSS or PISA, you have these additional ones and they all come in statistically significant. So the ones that we have are never enough. There's always more dimensions that we don't quite observe, and there's going to be lots of things that we will never be able to observe. So high income, high educated parents, there's a lot of variation within that group in terms of how much they support their children. And that, at the end of the day, we will never be able to observe all of that. But that's exactly why Guido's suggestion to go to something like this Altonji-Tabor type of analysis that actually tells us at least like how much variation would there have to be in the unobserved factors in order to fully take away the effect, gives you some idea and could actually corroborate your assumption that is probably, it can't be all selection, but I mean, so that would be useful to do.
And Ludger, I think our last question here for this first section is directed to you and Rick and Matt, which is what impact do we believe the current disruption in education delivery will have on the achievement gap? And how long will that impact persist? Is the change as a result of this COVID-19 break in educational delivery, will we see a permanent achievement gap as a result of it? And will that impact vary from country to country? And if so, how will the United States compare? So Rick, Ludger, and Matt, that'll be our last question for this morning's discussion.
So this is for Rick, of course.
Oh, there's one simple answer. The work we did in the OECD paper, which you can find on my website or the OECD website, doesn't explicitly break out disadvantaged from more advantaged students in our estimates of the long-term effects on individuals. But what we find is, unless something happens to improve the quality of the schools, there's a permanent loss to the current K-12 students that suffered school closures and probably suffer from the reopening. And we have other information from Germany and from the US that suggests that disadvantaged students, particularly low achieving students, have been hurt relative to more advantaged students, that more advantaged students have parents that are better able to provide the in-home instruction in the absence of teachers. And so what that's going to do is lead to an increasing achievement gap, because unless we do something to improve the quality of the schools. Just getting back to the 2019 levels of performance will not, in fact, make up, remediate the problems for the kids who were forced to be at home last spring in the US and in almost every country of the world. And a lot depends on the reopening, how bad it is. But this also affects US growth. We estimate that most likely if on average, the current cohort lost a third of a year of knowledge, of learning from this, that on average GDP for the remainder of the century will be 1.5% lower than it would have been had there not been this pandemic. And so everybody is rightfully concerned about how do we reopen schools and what are the mechanics and logistics of all of this. But we really have to, at the same time, focus on how we can improve the quality of our schools, which is possible, in order to remediate the problems.
All right, thanks. I guess this basically closes our session. I think this gave us a great introduction into the day. Thanks to all the presenters, and I thank you very much for having me. I'll give it back to CR.